if you look closely, you will notice that there are lots of people who follow a ketogenic lifestyle or who are experts, speakers, advocates for ketogenic diets who literally have made their living as speakers in this area who are themselves morbidly obese. And I don't mean obese by bodybuilder standards. Oh, you don't keep a shredded 8-pack with veins through it year round. I'm talking, with a belly that extends at least 6 to 8 inches past their nipples. Okay, I can think of at least 3 off the top of my head. Gary Taubes, Dr. Adkins, who is that Jimmy whatever guy? I think he went to prison for something. Right, these are all people who promoted ketogenic lifestyles, okay, who are all extremely unhealthily morbid obese in spite of promoting these sort of lifestyles for 5 or 10 or longer years. All right, I know people who follow these sort of lifestyles who still don't look fit, and again, I'm talking 5+ years. So this is something that people need to think about. And they're like, but I do know someone who lost weight or I have lost some weight while doing it. And no one's saying that you can't. Any diet that restricts what you eat and helps you control appetite and creates a calorie deficit will over time help you get leaner. But the problem is that if it's not creating a calorie deficit, that's not going to happen. And the problem we have is that these diets are all high in fat, which is really the only macronutrient we store as fat. Again, this is not a controversial statement. It is well supported in the metabolic ward. It's well supported in direct human studies, clinical trials where we measure this stuff. 99% of the fat on all of our bodies came originally from fat that we ate. Okay, and that is as close as we have to a scientific fact as far as our species Homo sapien and fat storage. Furthermore, saturated fat is the type that we store at the most efficient rate, right? It requires the less energy expenditure, the least chemical transition, and it's the easiest one for us to store. These diets tend to be high in that, and that's unavoidable. All right. We also know that as a general rule, saturated fat, when administered in the metabolic ward, had a calorie for calorie compared to anything else, including refined sugars, causes slightly more insulin resistance. Okay. Refined sugars are pretty high on that list, like refined fructose, but saturated fat actually beats it. Saturated fat also is stored as liver fat, creates fatty liver at a slightly higher rate than refined sugars. And when I make that statement, I am not telling you to eat refined sugars. I don't think that they're a good idea. But they don't store directly as body fat. Okay? They might predispose you to storing body fat easier, sure. But you still have to eat the fat. And therein lay the problem with this sort of diet. There are definitely people who've been successful on it, but there are also people who remain unhealthy and morbidly obese. They're just as sick, just as obese as the average American is, if not worse, but they don't get to enjoy any bread. It's like they're not even getting a benefit from it. But that is something that people have to keep in mind with these sort of diets when they get into this zealotry and adherence to them. They can work for some people in some situations, but they are far from ideal, right? They're far from ideal, and they are heavily marketed. And people have to remember, at the end of the day, no one has ever gotten fat because they're eating white rice and bananas, okay? And again, we could look in the metabolic ward, but you can look at epidemiology. Look around the world at the countries and societies that eat the most white rice. I mean, that is a perfect example that shows you that the insulin obesity hypothesis, before we even get into the medical ward, right, in the obesity ward and all of this, in the metabolic ward, okay? Because people want to say, well, you can't use epidemiology. Really, we can use epidemiology, because what we do in studies is determine why the epidemiology shows what it shows. Okay, that's the idea. It's like, why is it doing it? What's the causation? eating rice is associated at a population level with low levels of obesity, with low levels of diabetes, with low levels of cardiovascular disease. Okay? I'm sorry, that is at the population level. If starchy carbs and insulin response from starchy carbs was in any way related to obesity, you would see an obesity problem in those societies and countries that have pretty much unlimited access to white rice, where it's a staple calorie. Because even a lot of poor countries have access to that. It's so cheap. Okay? But then you look at elite athletes around the world, some of the leanest, fittest athletes in the world. White rice is probably the single largest calorie source at the global level for elite and professional athletes as well. Okay? It just is. Right? What does this tell you? Right? This tells us when we look at this that this doesn't work, that this hypothesis is nonsense. And then when we study it in the lab, we understand why it's nonsense. Okay? And that is the problem with this approach. But the problem is that, the keto zealots are so militant about it that when you make pro-carbohydrate videos or you discuss the negatives of their stuff, they come in and force and argue with you. And they want to bring up studies from 20, 30, 50 years ago as the foundation of it, while then claiming epidemiology can't be used. Okay. Even though if what they were saying is true, you would see that. You don't see leanness in societies that eat ultra high fat, right? You don't see it. You see it in the ultra high carb, low fat societies, okay? But then when we get to the actual studies and we look at the modern studies in the metabolic ward, we understand why, right? We understand why. Humans don't store carbohydrates as fat. But, any diet that creates a calorie deficit will cause some fat loss, right? You can't get around the energy in, energy out equation. And ironically, when these same people say, well, not all calories are created equal, you're right. Saturated fat is probably the worst calorie you can eat in terms of body composition. So you're right. Absolutely right. They are not all created equal. The problem is that dietary approach literally pushes you in the wrong direction. And that is why you see so many zealots of it and adherents to it who, in spite of some having success, who are the complete opposite. 5+ years, 10+ years on this sort of diet, and they're still obese. Okay? Still have high levels of adiposity. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.